Welcome to another special from Window World. We've had a few weeks off and I've been preparing an audio book, which I've talked about previously, and that will be available soon. So tonight we're going to carry on with our deep dive into history and particularly the Shattered Isles and the shows that we did previously about the Druids. So I'm going to be referring to several documents tonight, and the whole purpose of these shows is to have philosophical purpose and directed information which is of use to the viewer, so that we don't have any shows which are merely full of waffle. And I do get sent a lot of that stuff, and that's the purpose really now of Windows on the World, is this lifelong learning project, which seems to be appreciated by a select few, which is a good thing. And it's all about a learning process. And one thing I wanted to bring up was that there has been a massive infiltration of historical misinformation through the New Age and the adoption of the ancient traditions, as though the people who are making these cartoons and dressing up in fancy dress, really is what they're doing, has kind of diminished the spiritual power of the original religion of the British Isles, and also Christianity, which was absorbed by the Druids. So we're going to be referring to several books this evening. One is The Riddle of Prehistoric Britain by Comyns Beaumont, Druids, The Ancient Faith of Britain by Dudley Wright, and Avebury by William Stukeley. So Riddle of Prehistoric Britain was written in the early part of this century, as was The Ancient Faith of Britain by Dudley Wright, and Avebury by William Stukeley was actually written in 1743. And these books give us an insight into what the history really was of the British Isles before the New Age infiltration. And I did put a show up a couple of days ago about that because it's been in the archive a long time. It was about Maurice Strong, the UNCED conference, the Rio conference of '92, and the whole Gaia cult, which has been imposed as a business plan for the world, which we've done many shows on. So if we go back to the early part of this century and the late 1700s, we can find some unpolluted information which has not been infiltrated by New Age thinking, which is very important. There's a Druidic statement which is very relevant to this evening's show, and it goes like this: Nid dim ond Dieu, nid Dieu ond dim, which means God cannot be matter, and what is not matter is God. And that was a pretty profound statement by the Druids, which was from the book Avebury by William Stukeley. And we are used to places of worship being imitations of the past. In other words, cavernous cathedrals, a testament to the architectural achievement of man, really about the ego and the abilities and achievements of mankind in putting this ceiling where the sky should be. And that is one of the most important things about these ancient forms of worship. So cavernous cathedrals are a testament to the architectural achievement of man, full of distractions. And before that, of course, churches and temples. So I'm going to read out something which is quite prescient to what we're going to be talking about. And it's from our series, The Perfected Minefield. And you can find that series in the playlists section on our YouTube channel. And this is from Ritual and Religion. And it talks about the modern world religion, which actually comes from a Latin word called religio. Now, according to the first definition available on the internet, religion is the belief in and worship of a superhuman controlling power, especially a personal god or gods. However, the word religio from the Latin, which predates it, describes something very different. Religio means to come into contact with the supernatural and the experience of that, which could bring both fear and awe. So this is not an experience which is merely some kind of pleasant insight. We're talking about things which actually change our way of viewing the whole of reality. And that's what religio was all about. And it meant fear in the respect that it was something outside the experience of the experience. So the whole idea of the church and the capturing of people through religion was to impose an experience on the experiencer through a third party. And this is an interesting fact. The Corpus Inscriptionum, which is a compendium of Latin words, does not now include the word religio, which was very popular in pre-Roman times and during the times of the Roman occupation in Britain. So the word predates any kind of state-organized or sanctioned doctrine, which is probably why it's been taken out of use by the Roman Church. The word describes personal revelation independent of anything externally organized. So in effect, it means direct communication and communion with something outside everyday experience. And this is before the state had interfered, of course, intervened with organized religion. Direct revelations were brought into line with already established beliefs through a belief system. So religio was outside of and before the time of state-sanctioned doctrine. Ritual and official administration of religious matters is what replaced religio. A quote now from Cicero, the Roman lawyer, and he stated, "Religio observes due ritual attention to a higher being, that which people call the divine. The direct experience is outside an organized ritual with its controlled incantations and actions." And we covered that in those particular shows, and it's very relevant to what we're going to be talking about this evening in this show. And in organized religions, we have become to a large extent robotic and empty through imposed ritual and dogma. So the word religio was used in everyday language, even by laymen in Roman times. However, religion, apart from religio and wisdom, are inseparable. So religio and wisdom are inseparable and separate from religion. So simply, religio describes the essence of the experience, not the ritual or church or organized practice or prayer. Any sacrifice is wholly within the mind of the worshipper, not an external thing. So when we go into the age of sacrifice, then the real sacrifice is of ourselves. So the realization is that sacrifice is of the self and the opening of the mind. That's what religio was really all about. And of course, the cult of Mithra was the absorption into decoy Christianity of Constantine, and the Pharisees' rules and rituals and the flocks of the Catholic Church retained ritual for the very purpose of compliance and control. So just before we get into the real body of this show, and the body of this show is in effect the true Jerusalem, which is the seeking of our real selves. So a sign came up with the feed that's coming from the fake state of Israel, the modern day state of Israel, is when the sign said, the Jerusalem, the capital, there can only be one Jerusalem. So the fake one seems to be coming to an end, and the real Jerusalem is not a physical place. However, the real Jerusalem could well have been destroyed by Hadrian, but the land mass it is on remains, and that is in Scotland, Edinburgh. So if you check out our shows on Jerusalem, you can go to the homepage at windowsontheworld.net. There are 3 shows which state that the Jerusalem which we're talking about is not the Jerusalem which was relocated to the Middle East and the modern day state of Israel, which was created in 1948. Let's now get on to William Stukeley's Avebury, a temple of the British Druids, written in or published in 1743. I think Stukeley's very prolific, and he gets a bit wordy, as a lot of the people in the 1700s did, but there's some great information about the old religion, and in particular, of course, Avebury. So in Stukeley's Avebury, we find that a true temple was always round with no ceiling, or it was in an oak grove. So a true temple is not in a square building. This is very important because it seems that when the Freemasons stole from the Scandinavian occultists their rituals and the rituals of what were known of the ancient Druidic priesthood, that these temples became square, and the square and the compasses became the temples and the symbology of Freemasonry. So a very important point is that the real places of worship were the oak groves in ancient Britain, and of course across Europe into many other countries around the world. And this is a very important thing we're going to get into in how the Cromlech and Dolmen builders actually expanded. It appears that it started in the British Isles and expanded outwards. And we have the cataclysm of 1322 BC described by Comyns Beaumont in The Mysterious Comet as the inciting incident for the building of these ancient shelters, in effect bomb shelters, which were to protect people from what was falling out of the sky. Example being the comets which came and destroyed civilization. So a true temple is round with no ceiling. A grove was traditionally congruent with a temple. The corrupted temple was square and covered as in the tabernacle. So, in other words, even if the temples were round, they had no ceiling. So the sky is the true ceiling. And that's a very important point that Stukeley makes in this particular book. I'm going to go now to Druidism, the Ancient Faith of Britain by Dudley Wright. The Druids held that the Supreme Being was too exalted to be confined within temples made with hands. Their open-air temples were circular in form, and in their worship they made use of the circle to intimate that God was to be found in every direction. The Druids believed that the eternal could not be limited locally to anywhere. So, in other words, when the celebration, festival, ritual, meeting had actually finished, there would be no trace of it. Nobody would know where these people worshipped because everything vanished into the ether, which is why they carried everything around in their heads through the oral tradition. All makes sense. So the Druids believed that the eternal could not be limited locally. So a perfect solution is also to have a non-local place. That means, of course, your temple can never be destroyed because your temple is carried around and it's in the natural surroundings. So this is much more practical than the later idea of temple building. So everything vanished into the ether and no one was the wiser under the temples of the oak trees. So let's now have a quote from Dudley Wright's book. There is no passage in any classical historical document which connects the Druids with any particular stone monument or temple. It is though believed that they occasionally used the stone circles, and the main place of worship in the British Isles was Avebury, which is described in his book as the Serpent Temple. That's in William Stukeley's book, Avebury. He describes Avebury as the Serpent Temple, and this site predates Stonehenge. And the Druids, we have to remember, had their history rewritten by the Romans in favor of themselves. So the Druids believed the natural order is present in the natural world. The artifice of the controllers built majestic palatial structures, built on the idea of control and conquest in a way. Because if you were part of one of these original orders, then there would be no solid material place of worship, unless, of course, it was one of these major sites, which do include Stonehenge, many circles, of course, Callanish in Scotland, and all the ones throughout the British Isles and Brittany, of course, where the Druids extended. And we do also have to remember that the main centre of teaching for the Druids was the British Isles, and we had the Isle of Anglesey or Mona as one of their main places, the Isle of Wight and the Isle of Man, and of course spreading out into the Scottish Islands. So for real power and conducive connection to the natural world, they were connecting with the natural surroundings, which makes complete sense. So the real Israelites, according to Beaumont and according to the research that I've been doing over the past many years actually now, followed this system before, of course, the Pharisees and the scribes used their community control system of temples and man-made ritual. And of course, we can say the same thing for the Roman Church of Constantine. So this actually became a neurosis, which has ended up in what is happening today. So we're seeing the end of something, a manipulated man-made neurosis, when in fact it could have been more conducive to actually go along with the natural order of things and follow the true early Christianity, which, as we've said in these shows, was probably, and I would say most definitely, founded in the British Isles. So yeah, William Stukeley's Avebury, written in 1743. Give you some quotes, because this is going to be a very dense show. One of the reasons I haven't done a show for a while was because I'm putting together quite a lot of information, never want it to get stale and never want to repeat anything. Quote, "Whatever we find in history that looks like idolatry is not to be referred to the Aboriginal Druids, but to the later colonies from the continent. We find on the continent idolatry crept on by degrees universally, which was the occasion of providence, exerting itself in the Mosaic dispensation, and thereby changing the manner of these temples, which were altogether polluted. Nevertheless, we have no reason to think but that the Druids in this island of ours generally kept up to the purity of their first and patriarchal institution." So that's an interesting quote, because when we look at the major monument right in the heart of England, Avebury, then we can see that this would have been a centre which would have been used for special occasions, but the main day-to-day business, meetings, rituals and spiritual practices of this ancient faith of Druidry were held in nondescript places which could never be described, because Britain was covered in oak trees, as was most of Europe. The oak groves were the places of worship. So what we get from all of these writers and the history going back to the ancient monument builders is that the constructions were always of rude stones. That means unfashioned stones, untouched, upright in the ground, round in form, and open again in a circle. Avebury, huge circle. Stonehenge, a circle. In hot countries, groves were planted around them. So the circle at Avebury, the front part of the Avebury circle, is the snake leading towards Kennet, and of course West Kennet Longbarrow, which is described as a passage grave. It has megaliths at its opening, and it is in fact full of, I think it's 4 different rooms in there. So these places were used for the depositing of bones later. This is what seems to be the case. And an article came up recently which confirmed this, which is what we've been saying, that the Longbarrows, where these bones were found, were not burial chambers. They were underground chambers, primitive bomb shelters. And that has now been confirmed by findings of bones which were not congruent to the age of the building of the Longbarrows. So in other words, they were used by much later people as burial chambers because they were already there. He describes the hind part of the snake leads towards Beckhampton, for they may well all be looked on as avenues to the great temple of Avebury, which part must be more eminently called the temple. So Avebury is one large open temple, along with the temporal natural temples of the oak groves, which were all over Britain and of course Europe, where this ancient religion spread to. Let's have another quote. "Out of this noble circle of stones, 100 in number, there was left in the year 1722, when I began to write, just over 40 still visible, whereof 17 were standing, 27 thrown down or reclining, 10 of the remainder, all contiguous, were at once destroyed by Tom Robinson in 1700, and their places perfectly levelled for the sake of the pasturage. So the farmer knocked down the sacred stones of Avebury. In the north entrance of the town, one of the stones of a most enormous bulk fell down and broke. It measured 22 feet long. Reuben Horsall, clerk of the parish, remembers when it was standing. And when my late Lord Winchelsea was there with me, we saw 3 wooden wedges driven into it in order to break it into pieces." So let's go to the future or the present. There are now 36 stones still standing out of an original estimated 154. If you look where the small amount of stones is, that will give you an idea when you look at the spacing as to how many there actually were. So we're going now to The Druidism of Britain by Dudley Wright. "The inner enclosure of the Druid circle was always rough, unhewn stone, just as the Israelites had used the same, as we find in several Bible references. Exodus 25:26. And if you make me an altar of stone, you shall not build it of hewn stone, for if you use your tool on it, you have profaned it." Deuteronomy 27. This is about Mount Ebal. "Build there an altar to the Lord your God, an altar of stones. Do not use any iron tool on them." So let's carry on now with the age of the Green Cathedral. So the need for temples as places of worship has controlled the masses. Little more than communally enforced observance to repeated ritual and repetition, and the most successful control mechanisms being the Roman cult and Orthodox Judaism. Islam, of course, followed. They all work hand in hand at the top level. a look at the inaction against what's happening against fake Israel is a good example of where that led. And this project is coming to an end. So I'm going to give you some more information now. And we've talked about Constantine before, the Council of Nicaea, and the imposition of this new fake Christianity onto the original Christianity, and the relocation of the original Christianity to this newly named place, onto the original Christianity, and the relocation of the original Christianity to this newly named place called Israel, onto the original Christianity, and the relocation of the original Christianity to this newly named place called Israel.